Welcome to another episode of Defending the Line. I'm Christy Shepard, and this is my podcast to share the story of what happened in the murder of my cousin Debbie Carter in our small Oklahoma town, and how finding out the men convicted of that crime were innocent turned into a quest for truth and accountability. In the last episode, I talked a little bit about my efforts to start an Innocence Commission in Oklahoma, and that really not only came from wanting something positive to come out of, what happened to Debbie, but also learning about the bigger issues of wrongful conviction. And I learned that some of the biggest contributing factors were jailhouse informants, misuse of forensic science, false confessions, faulty eyewitness ID, and prosecutorial misconduct, all of which happened in Debbie's case. And when I was working to get my ducks in a row and take all this information to my local senator in hopes that we could pass a law to get an Innocence Commission, at that time we had about 10 exonerations in Oklahoma, DNA exonerations anyway. And there was Thomas Webb, who'd spent 13 years in prison for rape, Timothy Durham, who spent 3.5 years in prison for rape. There's Robert Miller, who spent 9 years on death row for rape and murder. And of course there was Ron Williamson and Dennis Fritz. There was Jeffrey Pierce, who spent 15 years for rape. Arvin McKee, who spent 14 years for rape and murder. There was actually another case out of Ada, a man by the name of Calvin Scott, who spent 20 years in prison for a rape he didn't commit. There was Greg Wilhoit, who spent 4 years on death row for murder. And David Bryson, who had spent 17 years in prison for rape he didn't commit. And when I had initially compiled this list, I learned that there were only 6 of the 10 cases where they had identified the real perpetrator, but yet only 3 of those cases were prosecuted due to the statute of limitations running out on rape cases. So 3 rapists had gone free. And in the 4 cases where there had not been an identification, that meant that there was 3 more rapists and a murderer who had gone free. Since then, we've had other DNA exonerations, which included Curtis McCarty, who spent 21 years on death row, John Tallbear, who spent 26 years, Cedric Courtney, who spent 16 years, Michelle Murphy, who spent 19 years, and another case from Ada, a man by the name of Perry Lott, who spent 30 years in prison for a rape he didn't commit. And there's been other exonerations. Those were the DNA exonerations. Now, according to the National Registry of Exonerations, the newest data is that there's about 2,820 wrongful convictions across the country, with about 375 of those being DNA. And out of those 375, the real perpetrator was found 180 of those cases. And those people, in those 180 cases, there were numerous other rapes, murders, and violent crimes that those people had committed separate from the case, they had not been caught for. And just in Debbie's case, we know that there were 4 other women who have testified that they had been raped by Glenn Gore. And so I'm not even sure that those women are considered in any of these statistics because those cases were never reported or charged. Those women came forward during the sentencing portion of his trial for Debbie's murder. And so I really had high hopes for this bill because, again, I wanted it to be law. I wanted something that would bear her name and hopefully make a difference. And when I met with my senator, she seemed to be very concerned about the same issue and agreed that she would carry the bill in the upcoming legislative session. And so Debbie's bill was formed, and it was an act of creating a commission to investigate and prevent re-victimization of victims' families and mistaken convictions, which was to be the Oklahoma Innocence Commission. And I was super excited. I had still been probably meeting and talking weekly with my friend Stephen, and by then my more suspicious attitude toward him had really shifted into friendship and trust. And he always answered all my questions and took my calls, which I'm sure were numerous. And he really helped me to understand that changing the system started with changing the laws that govern the system. And his guidance and advice was priceless. But one piece of advice really struck a chord much later than when he initially said it to me. But he said, just remember, when dealing with politics, prepare to be disgusted. And at the time he said that, I was kind of like, oh, sure, of course. But that would really sink in much later. And leading up to the filing of Debbie's bill, I had no experience in policy. Not even my criminal justice background had prepared me past general government classes and things like that. And I really was quite naive in thinking that advocating for something like this it seemed so easy. It seemed like a win-win. I really did not see advocating for wrongful conviction to be political in any way, and I didn't see how anyone could say no to such a thing. I mean, it wasn't going to cost anything. It was a voluntary commission, and it seemed like the right thing to do. When there's a plane crash, moments later there are professionals on the scene to investigate and find out what happened, and they evaluate everything, piece it all back together and want to learn about and study about what happened so that it never happens again. But what I would learn is that there is this deliberate reluctance to change things within the criminal justice world. And so week after week, I would go to the Capitol and knock on doors and tell senators about the bill and how important it was. And many times people would meet with me, and then other times they refused to meet with me because I wasn't one of their constituents. And finally, the bill got assigned to a committee, kind of a general committee, and Peppy and I went to the hearing for that bill to be read. And I was really astounded at how ill-prepared and disorganized many of the senators were. Some of the bills sounded ridiculous, and there was actually 2 senators who got into a heated debate over the fact that one thought a bill was too wordy. And this went on for, seemed like hours. And I knew that if Debbie's bill wasn't heard that day, it wouldn't pass out of committee. And I was beginning to get very nervous as I kind of sat and listened to some of the ridiculousness that went on that day. I remember there was one proposal of a bill that would limit, it would be a 2-drink maximum on your 21st birthday to be consumed only between the hours of 10 a.m. and noon. And this went back and forth for what seemed like forever. Who would be responsible for counting the drinks, and how would you know if they went to a different bar, and why between 10 and 12? And I mean, it just went on and on. And the longer I sat there, the more anxious I became. And I sat there with my little folder in my lap, and I was, ready to speak about the bill, if my senator felt like I needed to. And finally, toward the end of the meeting, they did call Debbie's bill for a vote. And there were no questions, and there was no debate. And the bill passed right on to the next committee. And I was relieved, but a little disappointed that no one seemed to feel the gravity of the importance of this bill, at least the importance that I felt it was. And the bill just seemed to move through this political machine, and it began to change and take a little different shape as different groups and individuals weighed in. And one of the first things to go was the name. And they wanted the name Innocence Commission out. And so they changed it to Justice Commission, because it was felt that the word innocence was soft on crime, which I didn't understand, because the people who had been wrongfully convicted hadn't committed a crime. But there was also, they took any subpoena power away from the bill, and they put a sunset period on it where I guess it would end in 2 years. And even through a high school friend, I was able to get a private meeting with the Attorney General, which was really gracious, and I was, super thankful for. And he was very nice, and he listened to what I had to say. And at the end of our meeting, he just said, I tell you what, how about I don't get in your way? And I wasn't really sure what to make of that, and I was a little confused, but I was going to take it as a positive and move on. And one evening, I had received a phone call from my senator that Debbie's bill had been taken to the Senate floor earlier in the day. And I was really not pleased about this because I had let her know that I wanted to be present for any vote and debate on what was going on. And she said it had happened last minute and they took it to the floor, and that they were actually dragging senators out of the bathroom to come and vote. And it passed out of the Senate with a straight party line vote, Democrats on one side and Republicans on the other, except for one Republican senator who voted for the bill. And it was actually very much because of him that the bill was able to pass on. And later I went to his office and personally thanked him for crossing party lines and doing what the right thing to do was. But passing out of the Senate was only half the battle, and now the bill would go to the House. And Debbie's bill was assigned to the House Judiciary Committee. And the chairman of this committee was a man by the name of Gus Blackwell. And I met with him on several different occasions. Peppy and I met with him. But regardless of how many meetings and almost my downright begging, he would not give the bill a hearing in his committee. And in person, he would tell me that he would check it out and that he would talk to the Sheriff's Association. He would, talk to different groups of people and get back with me. But then he would say things to the paper and to the media there around the Capitol that it just wasn't a well-written bill. And when I would show up at the committee meetings, he wouldn't even look in my direction. He paid no mind to me at all. And I would show up at these committees and just sit and in hopes that he would do the right thing. And he never did. And the bill never got a hearing. And with one man's decision, Debbie's bill died that legislative session. And later I read an article where in 2016 Mr. Blackwell was indicted on 44 counts or criminal counts and sued by the Oklahoma Ethics Commission. He pled guilty to one felony count of perjury to avoid jail time. So a few weeks after a very disappointing legislative session, it was announced that they would be having Glenn Gore's evidentiary hearing to get started for the fourth trial. And Peppy had asked me to go, and we'd made plans to go to the hearing and then maybe go to lunch afterwards. And the proceedings got underway, but before too long, the assistant district attorney started presenting the physical evidence in Debbie's case. And once again, there was the electric blanket cord and her cowboy belt, the ketchup bottle, the torn blue panties. And I remember Peppy placed her hand over her mouth and she closed her eyes and lowered her head. And he just continued to pull evidence out of the bag. And what seemed like it should be routine was just this nightmare starting all over again. And when the hearing was over that afternoon, I was kind of checking in with Peppy and asking her how she felt and if she wanted to go get anything to eat, and she just said, "Sugar, I'm gonna go home and lay down. I didn't know they were gonna pull out all that stuff today, and I just gotta go home." And she went home, and I, went my separate way. And as I drove away from the courthouse, I just became more and more angry. And on impulse, I just turned my car around and went back to the district attorney's office, and I rang the bell, and the victim coordinator came, and she was very sweet, and, "Hey, how are you? Come on in. Is everything okay?" And I stepped just inside the hallway, and I could see the assistant district attorney's office straight in front of me, and that he was sitting at his desk. And I could see the district attorney's office door was open just down the hall. I don't know that he was in his office or not. But I told her no, that everything wasn't okay. And that this is exactly why I wanted her to have meetings, so that she would be prepared for what was going to happen. Here they were again, dragging all this stuff out and talking about it, and she wasn't prepared. And I was just furious. I just told them, this is not going to happen this way again. I'm not going to allow it. And if they're not going to have meetings with her and prepare her for court this time, I'll just make sure that she doesn't come, because this isn't fair to her. And as I left, I remember walking back to my car thinking, oh my gosh, I can't believe I just did that. And I called my mom and I told her what I had done, and she really couldn't believe what I'd done either. But I was so tired of just their attitude of Debbie's family not mattering. And I'd had enough. It was beginning to feel more and more like Debbie didn't matter and her family didn't matter, especially after, how the legislative session had ended, and that we couldn't get any movement on getting any kind of change that seemed to be for the good. And this particular summer was pretty busy and crazy, and not long after the evidentiary hearing, I actually got a call. And I'll never forget when I answered the phone, this person said, "Christy, this is John Grisham from Charlottesville, Virginia." And it always kind of made me laugh that he explained who he was. And still, that's always the way he addresses himself when I talk to him now, which still kind of makes me laugh. And our first phone conversation wasn't long, and he had asked if, Peppy and I would meet with him the next time he came to Oklahoma. And he asked me to keep our meetings quiet, and as it got closer to the meeting, someone would let me know where and when we would meet. And I think a few weeks passed by, and I kept my word. I did not tell anyone that we would be meeting, and we actually met at a small hotel in Ada. And we all sat around the indoor pool. And Grisham was very appreciative that we came and agreed to meet with him. And he brought with him a gentleman by the name of Mark Barrett, who was Ron Williamson's attorney. And I had seen Mark at both the competency hearing and when Ron was released, but I'd never spoke with him. And he was is a really soft-spoken, just really gentle, genuinely nice person. And they just sat and listened and asked Peppy to start at the beginning and tell the story of what happened to Debbie and what we knew to have happened. And when Peppy got to the part where she talked about meeting with the detective and the district attorney, I noticed something changed. Mr. Grisham had been sitting forward, with his arms on his elbows, very intently listening to her story. And when she got to this part, he sat straight up, kind of alert. And Mark, who had been leaning back in his chair, kind of with one leg, over his knee, now his weight completely shifted, and I noticed he really leaned in and engaged in what she was saying. And I remember thinking, like, what is that? Why is this story so important? What about that has changed everything about how they're listening to this? And so I remember Mr. Barrett reiterated, like, wait, so Peterson and Smith were both there. And Peppy, who always seems like when she says yes, sir, it's like one word, yes, sir, she says. And so again, they're like, so you're telling us that they're both there for you to sign the papers for Debbie to be exhumed, that they're both there talking to you? And she's, yes, sir. I'm, telling you they were both there. And again, I'm just really kind of taken back at what it is about that particular part of the story that is so almost alarming to them. And later I would learn what that was, but that particular day we, left and said our goodbyes and nice to meet you, and, they would be in touch. And what I learned later was that across the country, prosecutors are protected by law under absolute immunity. And this immunity shelters them from being sued or criminally charged when prosecuting a case. Except if the prosecutor acts as an investigator in the case. So Peppy explaining that the detective and the DA being there together, having her sign the papers, that caught their attention because throughout the civil suit, the district attorney had maintained that he had never injected himself as an investigator or, as being a part of the investigation. So after my meeting with Mr. Barrett and Mr. Grisham, I was more intrigued as to how all this fit together. And I had obtained more of the depositions in the civil suit, and I would read and reread every word and take notes and highlight, trying to understand how all of this fit together. And I feel like I need to mention that all the things that I've talked about and all the things that I will continue to talk about are a matter of public record. It's just that I went looking for it. But these are also some of the things I've had a great deal of concern and anxiety about publicly talking about. So most of the officers that were deposed were asked about drug use and or the drug trade allegations, either about themselves or one another. And it was noted that every person who was being questioned was being shown exhibits to review. And in most instances, I didn't have access to those exhibits, so it was really difficult to get a full understanding of what they were talking about. But there was questions to one police officer who had allegedly arrested young girls and had sex with them. There was a line of questioning involving an officer in a paternity suit. There was testimony regarding an instance where a police officer had sent a woman to pose as a reporter and secretly record the attorneys of another officer who was in a dispute with the police department. And the reasoning he gave was to see what allegations were being made against them. And we'll talk a lot more about some of that later. But trying to help you who are listening understand how, in my mind, none of this fit, and why were they asking about any of this, was really confusing. But there was also a transcript of an interview with Gore that had been done at the prison by two officers. And it was actually conducted a few weeks before the DNA findings had come back in Williamson and Fritz's case. And Gore was asked if he knew Debbie and if they'd ever had sex. And there were times that he seemed really coy and would change the subject. Like he was quoted once as saying, "I don't know, we might have. Man, that's been so long ago, I can't remember all that." And then later said, "I guess, I don't know. It was somewhere, was coaching a t-ball team, I guess, right before her and Keith hooked up." Or he said, "I can't remember, she even came over and we went horseback riding." And when the officer tried to press Gore about this intimate relationship, he even said, "Man, that's kind of personal." And there were times that he would completely pivot and change the subject altogether and talk about how much he despised the district attorney. And then the officer would try to get him back on track, and he would again get off on his disgust for the district attorney. But in one part he said, this is a quote from Gore, says, "Understand what Peterson told me the night, and I'll tell ya what he told me like ya That night before the trial, he came in and told me, he said, "I'll tell you something just like this." He said, "You better hope you wouldn't be in there. You just better hope you wasn't in there." Which brought my mind back again to that handprint. And if this was true and that conversation took place, and there were many problems with that, but I wondered again if whose handprint that was. And throughout the interview, Gore states over and over that he did not have sex with Debbie the night that she was murdered. Not before walking her to her car, not in her car. He also stated that he'd never been in her apartment. And there's actually, and I don't remember if it was a Dateline interview or something where he actually said that on camera as well, that he had never been in her apartment. But I found it strange that he couldn't remember when or where he might or might not have had sex with Debbie. Or, playing as if he was such a gentleman and really couldn't talk about such private matters. But he knew exactly, after all those years, the name of her boyfriend at the time. And Gore stated, this is a quote from him, "Like I told you, if everything goes my way, I'll stand my ground. I don't have nothing to run from." And 44 days later, Glenn Gore walked away from the prison work site on I-35 in Purcell, Oklahoma. So I'd said too that I would be happy to answer questions. And I got a question from David, who asked, "Did anyone come forward who overheard screaming, etc.? I understand she lived in an upstairs apartment, so did anyone in an adjoining apartment give statements, or did they hear or see anything?" And Debbie lived in a little garage apartment that was right outside the back door of the home where her elderly landlords lived. And nobody ever reported hearing anything. And again, her little landlords were very elderly, and they both felt really, really just horribly bad that they never heard anything, because their bedroom window was on the same corner as the corner of her apartment, but her apartment was above the garage, so no one ever heard anything. So in the next episode, we'll talk about the fourth trial and what it was like for my family and our town when Grisham's book hit the shelves. So feel free to send your questions, and I will do my best to answer them. You can send them to defendingthelion@gmail.com. And also, if you like the podcast, I would appreciate if you would share it and subscribe. You can go to defendingthelion.com for other information and updates, as well as Defending the Lion on Instagram. You can also watch these episodes on YouTube at Defending the Lion. And as always, I thank you for listening.